The sun was beginning to set over Sacramento, casting golden hues across the streets as Eric Porter made his way home after a long day at the office. His sedan hummed gently as the cool air from the air conditioning mixed with the evening warmth. He adjusted the dial, feeling the stress of the day slowly fade away, and the radio provided a soft background to the otherwise busy city streets. As he approached a yellow light, he slowed, preparing to stop, but the light switched to red before he could make it through. Eric eased the car to the side of the road, letting the moment pass without much thought. However, just as he settled back in his seat, the flashing blue and red lights erupted in his rearview mirror, followed by the blaring siren. He frowned, a slight tension building in his chest. He pulled over to the curb, rolled down his window, and glanced in the rearview mirror again. Out of the police cruiser stepped Officer Bradley Larson, a man in his mid-30s with a short buzz cut and a badge gleaming on his chest. Larson strode towards the car, his movements confident, betraying a sense of authority that came from years on the force. "License and registration," Larson said sharply, his voice flat, carrying an undercurrent of impatience. Eric, unflustered, reached for his glove compartment, pulling out the necessary documents, and handed them over. His calm movements contrasted with the officer's sharp demeanor. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Larson asked, leaning closer to Eric's window. "I'm not entirely sure," Eric replied, maintaining an even tone. "I thought I slowed down in time, but I understand." Larson didn't immediately respond. Instead, his eyes narrowed, scanning Eric with growing scrutiny. It wasn't just a routine stop anymore. His posture subtly shifted. The way he held himself now told Eric that something had changed. Larson was no longer concerned with the traffic violation. There was something else, something more he seemed to be looking for. "You're not from around here, are you?" Larson asked, his gaze flicking to the address on Eric's license. "I moved here a few months ago," Eric answered without hesitation, his voice steady. "My address is on the license." Larson's eyes remained locked on Eric for a moment longer, not fully convinced. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" he pressed, his tone sharper now. "Just going home," Eric responded, his voice measured but unyielding. The question had a pointed edge, but Eric didn't flinch. Larson leaned in closer, the space between them tight with the officer's silent judgment. Something had shifted. The more Eric maintained his calm, the more Larson seemed to look for a reason to escalate. He could feel the officer's eyes scrutinizing him, as if searching for a crack, a sign of weakness, but Eric held firm. "You seem a little too calm for someone who just got pulled over for a traffic violation," Larson said, his tone shifting, testing. Eric didn't flinch. He simply met Larson's gaze evenly, his voice unruffled. "I believe in being clear about the reasons for an interaction like this. Transparency." Larson's expression tightened, and a small smirk tugged at his lips, though it was anything but friendly. "Step out of the car," Larson ordered, his voice now carrying an unmistakable edge. Eric's grip on the steering wheel tightened for a moment, but he remained outwardly composed. "Is there a specific reason for that, officer?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying a hint of caution. Larson's lips twitched, but he masked the irritation quickly. "I asked you to step out of the car. You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." The subtle threat hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Eric took a slow breath, pushed the door open, and stepped out of the car, his posture relaxed but deliberate. Larson's eyes flicked over him, sizing him up like a potential suspect. Eric stood slightly taller than Larson, his broad shoulders suggesting strength without any hint of aggression. His tailored suit and polished shoes suggested someone meticulous, professional, none of which seemed to matter now. Larson gestured toward the front of the car. "Hands where I can see them," Larson ordered, his voice firm. Eric complied without hesitation, placing his hands flat against the hood of the car. His expression remained unreadable. "Is there something specific you're looking for, officer?" Larson took a step forward, his eyes narrowing as he circled Eric, a quiet but unmistakable wave of aggression building between them. "Just routine," Larson muttered, almost as if trying to convince himself. "We've had some incidents around here. You can never be too careful." Eric turned his head slightly, meeting Larson's gaze. "Incidents involving men in business suits driving sedans? Or does this have more to do with something else?" The question landed hard, the impact sharp and immediate. Larson faltered, his composure cracking for just a second before he straightened again, an attempt to regain control. "Watch your tone," Larson growled, his hands subtly moving toward his belt, though his body language suggested the officer was becoming more defensive than authoritative. Eric didn't back down. He tilted his head slightly. "I'm simply asking a question." Larson's frustration began to bubble to the surface. His earlier confidence seemed to slip further as Eric continued to hold his ground. For the first time, Larson was the one on the back foot, unsure of how to respond. The moment was delicate, but it was clear now that this wasn't just a routine stop anymore, and Eric knew that it wouldn't end quietly. The tension between Officer Larson and Eric was thick, hanging in the air like smoke, and neither man seemed willing to break it. Larson took a small step back, but only to give himself space to assert control once more. His hand lingered near his holster, a reflex that was becoming more pronounced as the situation escalated. He was determined to put Eric in his place, but the calm in Eric's eyes kept him on edge. "Confidence, huh?" Larson muttered almost to himself. "You seem pretty sure of yourself, like you know how this is gonna go." Eric's response came slowly, deliberate. "Confidence isn't the issue here, officer. Respect is." For a moment, Larson stood still, caught off guard by the words. He had expected a flinch, a sign of submission. Instead, Eric's eyes remained steady, unwavering. It made him uncomfortable. The shift in power was subtle but undeniable, and Larson was starting to question whether this routine stop was as straightforward as he had thought. "You seem to know an awful lot about how this works," Larson pressed, his voice rising slightly. "You got something to hide?" Eric didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Instead, he folded his arms. His posture relaxed despite the tension that crackled in the air. "No, officer, I just believe in transparency. You know, being clear about the reasons for an interaction like this." Larson's eyes narrowed, his frustration evident. He took a few steps around Eric, his boots crunching against the asphalt as he tried to regain his dominance. "You think you're smarter than me, don't you?" he spat, his voice barely contained. Eric's expression remained calm, but the weight of his words hit like a controlled storm. "I don't think anything, officer. I just believe in fairness, and so far I'm not seeing much of it here." Larson froze, his anger momentarily stifled. The words hit him in a way he hadn't anticipated. He wanted to argue, to lash out, but something in Eric's voice made him hesitate. It wasn't just defiance. It was logic, a steady, firm belief in his own right to question. And that rattled Larson more than he'd like to admit. "You seem awfully confident," Larson muttered again, his voice tinged with both admiration and irritation. "You think you know how this is going to play out?" Eric didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tilted his head slightly. "Confidence isn't the issue here, officer. Respect is." A strained silence settled between them, but Larson refused to back down. His shoulders squared, and he took another step closer to Eric, invading his personal space. His voice dropped to a near growl. "You think you're too smart for this? Think you can talk your way out of a situation?" Eric met his gaze evenly, never backing away, never flinching. "I don't think anything, officer. I just believe in fairness." Larson's jaw clenched as he took a step back. His eyes darted to Eric's car, looking for something, anything, to justify his growing suspicion. He needed to regain control of the situation. "Turn around, place your hands on the hood," Larson ordered, his tone abrupt, like a man who had decided that any further questioning was a direct challenge to his authority. "I need to check for weapons." Eric raised an eyebrow, his voice tinged with disbelief but still measured. "Weapons? Do I look like someone who's carrying a weapon?" Larson didn't answer. He was done with words. With a quick motion, he stepped toward Eric, his fingers twitching near his belt. The movement was purposeful, calculated. He was trying to provoke a reaction, trying to force Eric into a position where he could regain the upper hand. Eric, however, didn't flinch. Instead, he exhaled slowly, keeping his calm, and turned around. He placed his hands flat on the hood of his car without a word. His movements were deliberate, controlled, like a man who had been in this position before. Larson approached him, his boots crunching on the gravel with each step. He patted Eric down roughly, his hands lingering longer than necessary, as if searching for something to justify his suspicions. But Eric didn't flinch. He didn't tighten up or stiffen in response to the invasive touch. He stood still, his posture relaxed but unyielding. "You're clean," Larson muttered begrudgingly, stepping back. His voice sounded annoyed, as though he had expected to find something, anything, that would give him an excuse to escalate further. Eric turned slowly to face him, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. "Of course I am." Larson took a step back, visibly frustrated. He had been hoping to break Eric, to make him nervous, to show him who was in control. But instead, Eric had stood firm, unwavering, a quiet confidence radiating from him. The balance of power had shifted, and Larson could feel it. "I'm not done," Larson interrupted, his voice rising again. His eyes flicked nervously to Eric's calm, unshaken demeanor. "You seem to know a lot about what I can and can't do. Care to explain why?" Eric folded his arms across his chest. His body language relaxed, but there was a sharpness in his gaze. "I've had my fair share of interactions with law enforcement," Eric replied evenly, his voice steady. "Let's just say I've learned a lot over the years." Larson narrowed his eyes, suspicion creeping in again. "So, what? Are you a lawyer or something?" Eric smiled faintly, the corner of his lips twitching just slightly. "Or something." Larson bristled, the ambiguity of Eric's response only adding to his irritation. He stepped closer, closing the space between them. His voice dropped to a near growl as he leaned in, his frustration evident. "You think you're smarter than me? Think you can talk your way out of this?" Eric didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he met Larson's eyes, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. "I don't think anything, officer. I just believe in fairness." Larson's frustration boiled over. He moved forward, invading Eric's space, his gaze hardening. "You think you're better than me?" Eric held his ground, his eyes steady. I just think we both deserve respect, Officer Larson." The words hung between them, charged with tension. Larson's eyes flickered briefly to Eric's badge, a momentary flash of recognition crossing his face. But before he could respond, Eric's voice broke the silence. "You seem to know a lot about what I can and can't do," Eric said softly. "But there's something you've missed. You've already made your assumptions about me. But you don't know who I really am." The words dropped like stones into the heavy silence, leaving Larson speechless for a moment. He was starting to realize that this wasn't going the way he had expected. Eric's calmness, his control, was throwing him off balance. The power dynamic had shifted, and Larson wasn't sure how to regain his footing. For a long moment, Larson stood frozen, his hand still hovering near his holster. Eric's words hung in the air like a challenge, unspoken yet impossible to ignore. The officer could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on him, the tension in the air growing thicker with every passing second. He wanted to speak, to justify his actions, to regain control of the situation. But for the first time in a long while, Larson found himself unsure of what to do next. Eric, standing tall and composed, didn't move a muscle. His eyes, sharp and unwavering, stayed locked onto Larson, waiting for him to make the next move. The balance of power had shifted entirely. Where Larson had hoped to impose his authority, Eric had quietly disarmed it with nothing more than calm, controlled words. "I think it's time you know who I am," Eric said again, his voice steady, unwavering. Larson swallowed, but the words still didn't come. His mind raced, trying to process the sudden change. The nagging question echoed in his thoughts. Who was this man? Why was he so calm? What was Eric hiding? But deep down, Larson knew this wasn't about a minor traffic violation anymore. This was something bigger, something more important than he could have imagined. Eric's hand dipped slowly into his pocket. Larson's eyes darted to the motion, his fingers twitching, almost instinctively, toward his belt. But Eric's movements were slow, deliberate, without a hint of aggression. As Eric pulled out a leather wallet and opened it, Larson's eyes focused on the object that emerged from it. A badge. Eric's voice broke the silence, each word sharp and deliberate. "Eric Porter, Head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division." The realization hit Larson like a freight train, his breath caught in his throat. The smug confidence that had defined his earlier stance vanished in an instant. He looked down at the badge, then up at Eric's face, but there was no hint of humor, no smirk. There was nothing but quiet authority and an unmistakable air of disappointment. Internal affairs? Larson repeated, his voice shaking slightly, the words barely escaping his lips. You're... Eric nodded, his gaze never leaving Larson. Yes, I oversee officer conduct. My job is to ensure that the people wearing this badge uphold the integrity and values it's meant to represent. Larson's mind raced, his thoughts stumbling over themselves. He had just profiled this man, treated him with suspicion, pushed him to the edge in ways he would never have dared if he had known who Eric truly was. And now, standing in front of him, Eric's calm was like an insurmountable wall. Larson had been so sure of his assumptions, sure that Eric was just another ordinary man who didn't understand his place. But now, in the face of Eric's authority, he was suddenly a man who had made a dangerous mistake. Eric's eyes remained locked on Larson, his voice soft but cutting. You know what the most troubling part of this interaction has been, Officer Larson? Larson's lips parted, but no words came. His throat tightened, and for the first time the officer was genuinely unsure of himself. He had stepped over a line, and the weight of it was beginning to sink in. It's not the profiling, Eric continued, his voice unwavering. Though that's bad enough. It's not the baseless escalation either. He paused, letting the tension build. It's the fact that you've done all of this without even realizing who you were talking to. Larson's breath caught in his chest. The realization cut deeper than he expected. He had acted without thinking, without considering the person in front of him. It wasn't just that he had pulled over the wrong man. He had wrongly assumed that Eric, because of his appearance, didn't deserve the respect that every citizen deserved. You assumed that I wouldn't know my rights, Eric went on, his tone calm but cutting. That I wouldn't understand the laws you're sworn to uphold. And why? Because I didn't fit your idea of someone deserving respect. Larson shifted uncomfortably, his body rigid with discomfort. His hand instinctively moved away from his belt, a gesture that seemed to represent his sudden loss of control over the situation. Eric's eyes never left him, but there was no anger in them, only a quiet understanding that seemed to unsettle Larson even more. People like me, Eric said, his voice quiet but firm, don't need to prove our worth. We're already worthy of respect, Officer Larson. The badge you wear doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you accountable to everyone. Larson's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of Eric's words sinking in. His face reddened, his mouth opening and closing as though he was searching for the right thing to say, but could find nothing that would undo the damage he had caused. Eric took a step forward, closing the gap Larson had instinctively created between them. You're going to take a step back, Eric said softly, but the command was clear. Return my documents, and think very carefully about what you say next. Larson's lips parted as if he was going to protest, but the words never came. He had lost the battle for control, and for the first time in this encounter, the weight of his actions was clear. His hand trembled slightly as he reached into his chest pocket, retrieving Eric's license and registration. He handed them back, his movements slow, as if every gesture carried the weight of his realization. Eric took the documents with a quiet nod, tucking them into his wallet. He didn't speak immediately, but when he did, his words were calm, yet heavy with meaning. Remember this, Officer Larson, he said, his voice low. The badge doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you accountable to everyone. As Eric slid back into his car and started the engine, Larson stood there rooted to the spot, watching him leave. The flashing lights dimmed as the siren faded, but the weight of the moment remained. The sun was low on the horizon now, casting long shadows over the street, and for the first time in a long while, Larson wasn't sure of what was coming next. Eric, however, knew exactly what he was doing. This was far from over. This was just the beginning. The next morning, Eric sat at his desk in the Internal Affairs office, a file open before him. Officer Bradley Larson's name was printed clearly across the top, his history laid bare. It wasn't just Larson who was the problem. It was the culture that allowed someone like him to feel justified in his behavior. And Eric knew that this wasn't just about one officer. It was about systemic change, A knock at his door broke his thoughts. Linda, his assistant, stepped in, holding a stack of reports. "Morning, Mr. Porter," she said, placing the files on his desk. "I've got the summary on last month's misconduct cases. Also, Chief Daniels wanted to remind you about the department review next week." Eric nodded, but his mind was already elsewhere. He needed to act, and he needed to act fast. "Can you schedule a meeting with Chief Daniels for this afternoon?" Eric asked, his voice firm. "There's something I need to discuss." As Linda left the room, Eric's thoughts returned to the issue at hand. The problem wasn't just one officer. It was a culture of unchecked power, of officers who operated under the assumption that they could act without consequence. Larson was a symptom, and it was time for Eric to do something about it. The real work was just beginning. The afternoon sun filtered through the blinds of Eric's office as he sat across from Chief Daniels in the conference room. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension, but Eric wasn't here to back down. He was here to change something, something that had been festering beneath the surface for far too long. Eric recounted the incident with Larson, his voice steady but carrying the weight of what was at stake. "I could have let it slide, Chief," Eric said, his tone resolute. "I could have written it off as just another bad interaction. But that would have been a mistake. Larson's behavior isn't an isolated incident. It's a reflection of how much work we still have to do." Chief Daniels rubbed his temples, exhaling deeply as the reality of Eric's words set in. "I know," he admitted, his voice low. "Larson's name has come up before, but we've always handled it internally, quietly. But we can't keep doing that. Not anymore." Eric leaned forward, his eyes locked with the chief's. "Quiet doesn't fix anything. Quiet lets it keep happening. We need to be loud, Chief. We need to hold ourselves accountable, starting at the top." Daniel studied him for a long moment, as if weighing the consequences. Finally, he nodded. "You're right. What do you propose?" "A department-wide review," Eric said without hesitation. "Not just of individual officers, but of our training, our protocols, and our accountability systems. We can't keep sweeping this under the rug. If we don't hold ourselves to a higher standard, how can we expect the community to trust us?" Daniel sat back in his chair, looking exhausted. But there was a fire in his eyes now, a sense of urgency that hadn't been there before. "You're going to ruffle some feathers with this." "Good," Eric said simply. "It's about time someone did." The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and reports. Eric worked tirelessly, compiling data, speaking with officers, and holding public forums to hear directly from the community. The Larson incident, once just a single traffic stop, became a catalyst for change. The spotlight was on the department, and Eric was determined not to let it fade. The change wasn't easy. There were those who resisted, those who preferred to keep things the way they were. But Eric's persistence paid off. A shift began to take place, slow but undeniable. Internal reviews were conducted, protocols were updated, and officers were retrained. Larson, for his part, faced an internal hearing and was suspended. But for Eric, the real victory wasn't in punishing one officer. It was in preventing the next Larson from slipping through the cracks. Months later, Eric stood at the podium of a community event. The room was filled with officers, city officials, and local residents. It was a moment of reckoning, and Eric's voice rang out across the hall. "Justice isn't just about catching the bad guys," Eric said, his voice steady but powerful. "It's about making sure the people sworn to protect and serve do so with integrity, fairness, and respect for everyone they encounter. That's the badge I believe in, and that's the badge we're building here, together." The applause was thunderous, but Eric didn't linger on it. For him, this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a better one. As he stepped down from the podium, his eyes scanned the crowd. Some were skeptical, some were hopeful, but all were listening. Change was never easy, but it was happening, one step at a time. Eric knew it wouldn't come overnight, but it would come, and that was enough for now. Lesson from the story. This story illustrates the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity, especially when doing what is right might not be the easiest path. Eric Porter's calm, composed response to Officer Larson's unjust behavior was not an act of defiance, but a demonstration of respect for fairness, transparency, and accountability. It's a reminder that authority comes with responsibility, not to assert control, but to serve others with integrity. The story also teaches us about the power of challenging assumptions and confronting systemic issues. Eric didn't just address one officer's misconduct, he identified a deeper problem within the culture of the department. By focusing on systemic change rather than individual blame, Eric set a course for lasting transformation, showing that true leadership comes from acknowledging flaws and working to correct them, even when it's uncomfortable. Ultimately, the lesson is clear. Accountability, fairness, and respect are the foundations of any strong system, whether it's law enforcement or any other institution. Standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, is the only way to create the kind of change that makes a real difference.